Hi, John Dixon here from the Centre for Public Christianity. We're talking with Professor John Lennox of Oxford about science, God, and the multiverse. John, you've made much, and in fact many scientists have made much of the fine-tuning argument that the universe seems to have these extraordinarily precise details in it that have produced life. The out clause, for those who don't want there to be a God, is to propose that there are many universes, millions of universes, the so-called multiverse theory. Firstly, can you explain that for those who aren't comfortable with that notion? And then I want to ask you a couple of questions about it.
I'm very interested in the way you put the question, the out clause for those who don't want there to be a God. Because there is a suspicion around that it's not just science that's driving this agenda, that it really is an attempt to get an out clause. Indeed, Professor Sir Martin Rees, our Astronomer Royal, has written a book called Just Six Numbers. And he discusses these six numbers, which are numbers connected with the fundamental constants of the universe. And he points out that they have to be just right in order to have a universe in which carbon-based life can develop. That's really the fine-tuning argument. We're in a very special universe. You can see it at a trivial level. If we were any nearer to the sun in our orbit, carbon-based life would be impossible because of the heat. Any further away, impossible because of the cold. If the Earth rotated any faster, there'd be no atmosphere. We get a free trip into space. If it rotated slower, we'd boil to death in the day and freeze to death at night. So even at a simple level, it's special. But when physicists talk about the fundamental constants of nature, and particularly the values they have to have in the origin of the universe, the hot Big Bang, then the probabilities, the accuracy has to be astonishingly small. Paul Davies, a very eminent person who works here in Australia, a theoretical physicist, said getting it right is a bit like hitting a 1 centimeter square target with a gun when the target is at the far side of the visible universe. You know, that kind of thing. That's what we mean by the fine-tuning argument. So people come along, like Sir Martin Rees, and say, yes, it is very surprising, but the surprise gets lost if you imagine there to be a possibly infinite ensemble of universes, they say, in which everything that can possibly take place does take place. Then you oughtn't to be surprised to find yourself in a universe like this, because after all, this is the only kind of universe you can find yourself in. Now, Martin Rees in his book says something like this. He said, the alternative to this multiverse is the creator, and he prefers the multiverse. Now that sounds a little bit like your formulation of the question in terms of an out clause. But let's give them the benefit of the doubt, shall we? That here are two alternative views. What about this multiverse? Well, first of all, we learn from these scientists that all these other universes are completely inaccessible to us. There's no real evidence that they exist. And in fact, some leading quantum physicists like Sir John Polkinghorne just think it's fantasy. And he says it's far more economical, if you want to use some kind of philosophical tool like Occam's razor, principle of economy of hypotheses, to have one single God responsible for this universe rather than multi-millions of universes that are inaccessible to us.
That's interesting, because having just read Richard Dawkins on this question, he says the opposite. He says postulating multiple millions of universes is the simpler option. Far more complex is an idea such that there's an intelligent being.
Yes, well, is it? Postulating multi-millions or an infinite number, whatever that means, of universes sounds a very complex thing, because you see, some of those universes are bound to be very much more complex than this one. I think Dawkins has forgotten that we live in a pretty complex universe to start with, so that's part of the multiverse. And others must be, by definition, because it includes all possible ones, much more complicated than this one, you see. Alvin Plantinga has got a lovely little codicil on this. He's one of the world's leading philosophers in Notre Dame in the States. he says that Dawkins at least admits the possibility there's a God. It's a very remote possibility because God is improbable. So, but if possible, since every possible universe exists, then there must be a universe in which God exists. But then there's only one universe, and the whole thing collapses, which I think is rather nice. Keith Ward adds, he's the professor, a Regius Professor of Theology, of Divinity at Oxford. He adds the point that the multiverse also creates all kinds of moral problems. You know, there's a universe in which I'm a decent chap. There's another universe in which I'm a thug or a criminal, and so on. And that kind of thing has led a number of philosophers to be extremely skeptical, especially since the scientific evidence just isn't there. But it's worth looking at another consideration, and that is John Leslie's argument. You see, all these probabilities that they're talking about that have to be fine-tuned are in this universe. So this is happening in this universe. And one of my friends, a philosopher of physics in Oxford, and he says the element of surprise doesn't reduce when you bring in a multiverse because these things are happening live in this universe. Here are all these probabilities that just have to be right. Now, Leslie's analogy, which bears some thinking about, is suppose at this very moment, and for all I know it may well be that some of your viewers feel exactly like this, suppose I've got 1,000 guns trained on me in a firing squad, and you say to me as the compere of this program, John, you oughtn't to be surprised to find yourself alive after they all shoot, because after all, that's the only thing you could experience. I might retort and say, John, I'd be very surprised if they all missed. In other words, you don't reduce that element of surprise. And John Leslie has done an interesting job in his book, and he's not a Christian, in his book called Universes, in teasing this out. So the multiverse theory sounds very impressive, but once you begin to see the evidence is missing, whereas on the other hand, I would want to argue that there's a great deal of evidence for one God, an intelligence behind the universe, then I think that the multiverse theory has not got too much going for it, really. Final point is, of course, if there is a God, he's perfectly capable of creating a multiverse. You see, again, philosophically, introducing a multiverse is not in itself an argument against God. It's an argument, it purports to be an argument against a certain collection of small probabilities. It's not an argument against God.